Trump and Putin prepare for talks on Ukraine. When and what to expect? Turkish President assures Trump of support for decisive and direct efforts on war, and how British Prime Minister Keir Starmer is likely ready to deploy thousands of British soldiers to Ukraine. We will talk about this with Jean-Pierre Filiou, is the French professor of Middle East Studies at Sciences Po, Paris School of International Affairs. Mr. Filiou, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us.
Many thanks for inviting me. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Following talks in Saudi Arabia on the 11th of March, Ukraine announced its readiness to introduce a 30-day ceasefire if Russia also adheres to it. Russian dictator Putin said that many questions need to be answered as part of such a ceasefire. In particular, whether Ukraine will continue to mobilize people and receive weapons, how the issues of control and verification will be resolved, and who will determine who has violated what along the 2,000-kilometer front line. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said that Putin was putting forward additional conditions for a halt to the hostilities, which indicates that he does not want to stop fighting. Mr. Filiou, how do you think, what specific mechanisms will be put in place to ensure that both sides adhere to the ceasefire, and who will oversee compliance along the 2,000-kilometer front line?
Well, first we have to talk about facts. I'm a historian myself, specialist of the Middle East. First, we are not talking even about the proposal for ceasefire. It's a truce, because a 30-day ceasefire is not a ceasefire, it's a truce. Second is what is crucial. Everything is a result of a meeting held in Saudi Arabia. The fact that Ukraine's fate can be settled in Saudi Arabia is pretty, disturbing, pretty new. The fact that it was decided without any European presence is another thing very disturbing. And in fact, this meeting in Saudi Arabia was itself the result of a meeting held a little bit than 1 month before between Russia and America in the Middle East, in Saudi Arabia, in order to restore high-level talks, which means that the Middle East has a crucial role now for the fate and the future of Ukraine. That is the things that we have to keep in mind. And also to keep in mind that even so he was not present at the meeting between the American and the Ukrainian delegation in Saudi Arabia, the key man is Steve Witkoff, who is a special envoy of Donald Trump in the Middle East, but now also for Russia and Ukraine, with General Gallup being only special envoy for Ukraine because he's deemed too close to President Zelensky by the White House. So we have a proposal of a truce, which is basically what the Kremlin wanted for the American and what the American have enforced on the Ukrainian delegation that wanted to show its goodwill after the crisis that we all know at the Oval Office on February 28. And now the ball is in the court of Vladimir Putin, and Steve Witkoff went over there at the Kremlin. He was kept waiting for long hours. He was only received during the night after President Putin had expressed his not only conditions, but his very long, this well-known position of what he wants from Ukraine, which is a capitulation. So not only we have no ceasefire but a truce, but we're not even talking about mechanism to monitor. And again, I have to insist on the role of Steve Witkoff, because he was also the key man for the truce in Gaza that went in force 2 months ago, without any mechanism of enforcement, without any observers, without any sanctions for potential violation. And this truce is already in crisis, in shambles, because Gaza is again under siege. So all we are talking about is very much depending on goodwill, and not only there is no goodwill from the Russian side, but there is no clear will by the American side to have enforcing mechanism. Everything is depending on the phone call that President Trump and Putin are supposed to have tomorrow on March 18. And on all this, also in the prospect of a summit of President Trump and Putin in Saudi Arabia, which is why the fact that all this took place in Saudi Arabia is so crucial.
Mr. Filiou, as you said, yes, President Donald Trump and Russian dictator Vladimir Putin are set to hold a phone call on Tuesday, March 18th, during which they are expected to discuss U.S. proposals for a temporary ceasefire in Ukraine. What do you think about the upcoming conversation, expected topics, and previous interactions?
You know, I'm a former diplomat. I've been into, conflict management, conflict negotiation for decades. So everything, I'm sorry to say, but I have to speak the truth, especially to my Ukrainian friend and especially from Kiev, is everything has been made in reverse. You know, this kind of talk should take place when the whole mechanism is already in place. While we have an open-ended proposal, you know, of a truce of 30 days, and then you send a special envoy to Moscow, and the special envoy to Moscow is supposed to come back with what he says, the commands of Vladimir Putin, which are in fact the well-known conditions that he always expressed and that always so detrimental to Ukraine's sovereignty and independence and freedom. And then, well, something should happen from the phone call that will be held. That's very disturbing, because usually a phone call between two presidents should be crowning a process of steady, serious, detailed, with a very specific mechanism. And so far, we have nothing of that. We are literally walking on thin air.
Also, we have news that British Prime Minister Keir Starmer is likely ready to deploy thousands of British soldiers to Ukraine. They may stay in the country for many years, reports The Times. According to the media, Starmer is ready to make an indefinite commitment to deploy British troops for as long as necessary, along with Western allies, in an attempt to keep the peace. The defense ministers of the Coalition of the Willing will meet in London this Thursday to discuss in detail where the peacekeeping forces should be deployed. About half a dozen countries, including Britain, France, Turkey, Canada, and Australia, are discussing plans to send up to 30,000 troops to Ukraine. Other countries are ready to help with weapons and logistics. How do you think, will these troops have a purely defensive role, or could they engage in active operations if hostilities resume? How will to the presence of foreign troops on Ukraine's soil?
We have to know what we're talking about. You know, we don't have to fall in the trap of alternative reality, you know, or alternative facts or truths. United Kingdom has been very keen from day one to defend Ukraine against Russian aggression. France, as you know, is also very active, and I don't stress that fact because I'm French. This is a reality. So France and the UK are literally leading this so-called coalition of the willing to support Ukraine's independence. But there is something very different between security guarantees, force being deployed in Ukraine in order to defend Ukraine's sovereignty, Ukraine independence, and peacekeeping force. In order to have peacekeeping force, you have to have peace. So far, I insist, and we have to be very lucid about it. Otherwise, we will fall in one way or another in Putin's trap and maybe in Trump's trap, we are talking about something that is very feeble, 30 days truce that Putin hasn't even accepted. So we are very far, a long way apart from any peacekeeping force. What President Macron, the French president, made it very clear is that France or the UK or other country are deploying troops at the request of the Ukraine independent and sovereign government. This is an agreement between Kiev and Paris, London, or other countries, and it should not be submitted to any Russian veto.
Mr. Filiou, also about one phone talk, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan spoke by phone with US President Donald Trump on Sunday, March 16th. Their conversation included a discussion on Russia's war against Ukraine. During the call, Erdogan expressed support for President Trump's direct and decisive initiative for the termination of the Russia-Ukraine war. He said that Turkey has been endeavoring for a just and lasting peace from the very beginning of the war and will continue to do so. The Turkish leader added, what concrete steps is Turkey willing to take to facilitate just and lasting peace beyond diplomatic statements? How does Turkey balance its role as a mediator while maintaining close ties with both NATO allies and Russia?
Well, as a Middle East specialist, I have to stress again the fact that the talks that led to this proposal of a truce took place in Saudi Arabia and not Turkey. Turkey could have been a good choice, from America's point of view, since Turkey was and is so important in NATO, is the second army in NATO in terms of infantry, and because of its very close ties to Russia. As you know, Turkey has hosted before talks between Russia and Ukraine, has facilitated exchange of prisoners between the two countries, and has been very proactive and in the release of some of the Azov defenders. But probably Vladimir Putin and certainly Donald Trump didn't want Turkey because Turkey is too involved in the protection of the Ukrainian sovereignty and in territorial integrity. So Turkey is trying to play a very clever balancing act by saying to Trump, well, it's wonderful what you said to terminate the war, but at the same time, in trying to keep all its options open when it comes to what could take place with Russia and Ukraine, the fact that not only the war should not stop, that there should not be even a truce of 30 days, but there should be some kind of escalation. And this, for Turkey, is a very dangerous evolution that they want to avoid. And that is why they have been so cautious, but that is why also they have been involved by the countries we mentioned before, the coalition of the willing, in the possibility of contributing also to defending one way or another Ukraine security by giving it guarantees, concrete guarantees. And this should go inside the framework of NATO with or without the United States. It's very strange, but now we're talking of NATO that could be without the United States in such a crucial crisis, or that could be as part of bilateral, trilateral, multilateral agreement between Ukraine as a sovereign state and other partners, including Turkey.
Mr. Filiou, you're as a professor of Middle East studies. Can you say in general how has Russia's war against Ukraine influenced Middle Eastern countries' geopolitical strategies and alliances?
Well, I have to stress to the Ukrainian audience that the war, the current war on Ukraine, in fact, started in the Middle East, and few people are aware of that. It was the so-called red lines in Syria, when President Barack Obama in 2013, instead of reacting to the chemical bombing by the Syrian Assad government on suburbs of Damascus that were held by the insurgents, well, he backed down. France was ready to go, but not America. And Putin's Russia understood pretty well that, therefore, Obama would not react when Putin would attack 6 months later Ukraine with the occupation and annexation of Crimea, and then the so-called hybrid war in Donbass. So everything started in the Middle East. Before, this conflict impacted the Middle East. You have to see it one way before seeing it the other way. And Russia extracted many critical resources from the Middle East in order to exert its aggression against Ukraine. You have the partnership with that could be even called by President Zelensky as an alliance with Iran, with now infamous Shahed drones that were launched on the Ukrainian cities very early in 2022, that now manufactured on Russian territory. All this started in Syria. Syria was literally the laboratory where this Russian, Syrian, Iranian alliance was carved and then used against Ukraine. And it's far more in that way that the Middle East impacted the course of the war against Ukraine, launched and prolonged by Russia, than the other way around. Because the Middle East, in fact, was more trying to get to limit the damages, with few exceptions, like United Arab Emirates, who literally chose the Russian camp, provided critical support to Russian aggression through the diversion of international sanction, the facilities given to oil shipments from Russian oil to be marketed, and the money laundering in Dubai, that is a key to the Russian oligarchs. Qatar tried to propose its mediation. Saudi Arabia has made it very clearly, and the de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, took the unprecedented initiative to invite President Zelensky to an Arab summit in 2023 in Saudi Arabia. And he forced the Arab leaders to listen to President Zelensky's speech. And at that time, there was a very an image that went viral, where dictator Assad from Syria, he took off his hearing device in order not to listen to President Zelensky and to prove to his master, dictator Putin, that he didn't even want to listen to Ukrainian words in an Arab country. So the other impact was, of course, from the point of view of the grain crisis. It's so important that Ukraine took this humanitarian international initiative to provide grain to countries around the world, but among them countries in the Middle East, like Syria, since the revolution that toppled the dictator Assad in December 2024, and this Ukrainian initiative has been very much welcomed.
Mr. Filiou, you talked about Saudi Arabia. How have Ukraine's relations with key Middle Eastern states evolved in terms of military, economic, and diplomatic cooperation since 2022, if we talk about not only Saudi Arabia?
Yes, I've been coming to Ukraine a few times since a full-fledged invasion, and every time talking with Ukrainian decision makers and observers and analysts about the need to really foster the Ukrainian position in the Arab world, in the Middle East. And this was certainly, there was this landmark initiative of President Zelensky attending the Arab Summit in 2023. But there was also the growing perception in Kiev that inside the global south, and how proactive Ukrainian diplomacy has been towards the global south, not only about Europe or the Western democracies, there was a special importance to be given to the Arab world. And so it has been through diplomatic channels, and it has been through general soft power, if I may say, to try to counteract the propagandas of the dictatorships, because Putin is very solid in his links with the various dictators, while the Ukrainian cause is appealing to many people in the Arab world. And as I just mentioned, the case of Syria is clear. In Syria, the Syrian revolution that eventually won in December 2024 was obviously conscious of the importance of Ukraine resisting Russia, and this helped to foster a new relationship between liberated Syria from the Assad dictatorship and the Putin de facto protectorate on the country, and the Ukrainian government.
Mr. Filiou, you told and you mentioned Iran. How has Iran's growing military cooperation with Russia, including supplying drones, affected security dynamics in both Ukraine and the Middle East?
Well, this is key. President Zelensky was the first one to coin the word alliance between Russia and Iran. And I think he was very lucid, and he tried to warn the rest of the world against this alliance, and especially Israel. And he delivered very strong messages to the Israeli Knesset, the Israeli parliament, to the Israeli public, the Israeli decision makers, but as you know, Israel didn't deliver any military help to Ukraine. So you have this Russian-Iranian alliance on one side that is about the drones, and the Shah drones that are famous in Ukrainian skies for all the reasons you know, unfortunately better than me. And fortunately, the Ukrainian Air Force has managed to deter and destroy in air those Shah drones despite the evolution of their technology. But you have also exchange of capacities in terms of missiles, ballistic missiles, and you have an alliance that is very strong when it comes to the support of the so-called pro-Iranian axis in the Middle East. And Russia has stuck to this alliance. And it's interesting to see that, like in the Arab world, it's an alliance between dictatorships, because Iran is supposed to be an Islamic republic, which has nothing to do ideologically with Putin's dictatorship. But they have this vested interest in supporting one another. And as I mentioned previously. It was in Syria, and it was in fighting against the Syrian revolution, fighting against the Syrian people, that they forged this alliance, that they forged the various types of Shahed drones, 1, 2, 3, and so on and so forth, and which is why also the Syrian people are so keen to see the Ukrainian resistance win and resist the Russian aggression, because they have been the direct victims of the Russian-Syrian Iranian unholy alliance at the time of the Assad regime.
Mr. Filiou, you said about Israel, why Israel still refuses to give military aid to Ukraine, and concerned with regional security and personal relationship with Vladimir Putin, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has preferred to remain neutral in the war, or something else?
Well, Netanyahu has a very strong and long partnership with Vladimir Putin. You remember, he even attended on May 9, on the Red Square, a parade of victory next to the Russian dictator. So first, he's close to him ideologically, but also Russia played very cleverly in Syria, because in Syria they made Israel believe at the time of the Assad dictatorship that they could deter the Iranian threat, and that was with one hand, the right hand or the left hand, and with the other hand, the left hand or the right hand, they were fostering Iranian in the framework of this unholy alliance that I was mentioning before. So Israel, contrary to Netanyahu's lambasting discourse, compromised its security at its northern border in the hands of Russia, and became vulnerable, while of course being the biggest ally of the United States of America in the region. But despite that, they were really scared by the Iranian threat at their border. So that's not the case anymore. But still, Netanyahu, because of the war that is raging against Gaza for the past 16 months, after the horrendous Hamas terror attacks of October 2023, then Netanyahu is now lobbying the Trump administration in order for the Russian base to be kept in Syria. So one might think it's pretty strange, but it's because you have two triangles, in the Middle East, but that have a very strong implication for Ukraine's security and future, and for Europe's security in the future. One between Trump, Putin, and Netanyahu for the reason I just mentioned, and the other one that we described before, between Trump, Putin, and Mohammed bin Salman, the de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia, which is why Steve Witkoff, the special envoy of Donald Trump, and who has been recently upgraded to ambassador by the US president, has been promoted and upgraded from special envoy to the Middle East, that's the first triangle, to special envoy to Russia and for Ukraine, and is deciding everything about Ukraine from the Kremlin, which is pretty ominous when it comes to Ukraine's sovereignty and security.
Mr. Filiou, Israel and Hamas have agreed to a ceasefire in the Gaza Strip. Al Arabia reported that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu allegedly called for the continuation of indirect negotiations with Hamas to maintain the ceasefire. Can parallels be drawn between Ukraine and Israel in their approaches to ceasefire negotiations and dealing with the hostile actors?
Well, I was one of the very few Westerners who was present inside the Gaza Strip at the time the truce was announced. It's like with Ukraine. It's not even a ceasefire, it's a truce, because the truce in Gaza that was implemented on January 19 was only a truce. Despite it being labeled a ceasefire, it should have become a ceasefire, but instead of becoming a ceasefire, it was suspended, and the full siege of Gaza has resumed since March 2nd, which means that we are again in a hostile context since siege is an act of war. So the parallel can be drawn in the fact that we are talking, and I'm sorry to come back always to Steve Witkoff, but really this character should be the center of interest in Ukraine, because what he does, what he thinks, what he behaves with Netanyahu on one side, with Vladimir Putin on the other side, is of crucial importance, and is the embodiment of the art of deal that Trump considers he's an expert. He's a very close partner in real estate business. In real estate business, you don't do diplomatic negotiation. In real estate business, you deal with what you have. And unfortunately, that means that generally the strongest party to the conflict is getting what he wants, because this party has enough resources to impose the deal. The deal is a deal. It's based on the balance of power. It's not based on international law. It's not based on resolution of the United Nations Security Council. It's not based on the Geneva Convention. It's a deal. And in the those people, when it comes to international relations, are pretty amateurs. They don't prepare their files. They are quite novice. And it was the case, when we heard probably about Trump's proposal to transform Gaza into the Riviera of the Middle East by expelling its population and making a real estate development area around it. So when I hear Steve Witkoff speak about, the 4 provinces of Ukraine that Russia is pretending to control, I'm pretty worried, because that means that he's already accepting the logic of the Russian aggressor, of Putin dictatorship, instead of saying, well, we have our red lines. When you have to make a deal for a deal, that means that you weaken your position at the very beginning of the talks. And the end game for Witkoff, and of course is the US President Donald Trump, is not sovereignty of Ukraine. It is a summit in Saudi Arabia between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump, in order for the two parties to have the better relations and cooperations without the Ukrainian being present, of course, and without the Ukraine being present either.
Mr. Filiou, thank you so much for this engaging conversation. I deeply appreciate the valuable perspectives and the thought-provoking discussion. I need to say that Jean-Pierre Filiou, French professor of Middle East Studies at Sciences Po Paris School of International Affairs, was with us today. Dear audience, thank you for your attention. Thank you for your likes. Don't forget to subscribe on our YouTube channel. We wish you all the best. And